Well, they have their windows down, also in a place far away from the window. I was trying to explain things, but I think you can hear them now. I'll go check on my parents. The more I walk, the speechless I get. You know, I used to thought...
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, October 17. That was Gazan journalist Plestia Alaquad reporting on her social media page as airstrikes destroyed her neighborhood. As we record this, a reported 300,000 Israeli soldiers are mobilizing at the Gaza border. The Israeli Defense Force is preparing to invade the Gaza Strip, an attack by air, sea, and land. This comes days after the Palestinian militant group Hamas launched an unprecedented and bloody attack on Israel.
Hamas will understand that by attacking us, they've made a mistake of historic proportions.
Hamas fighters kidnapped Israeli women, men, and children from their homes and left more than 1,500 Israelis dead in their wake. But on the other side of the border from Israel, Palestinian civilians are enmeshed in a devastating humanitarian crisis.
Ordered to evacuate within the next 24 hours from the north to the south.
Thousands have been killed, hundreds of thousands have become refugees, and countless people are struggling with severe shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Today, Chief Reporter Jordan Baker on what an Israeli ground offensive will mean for the people of Gaza. So Jordan, at the time that we're recording this, hundreds of thousands of people in the north of the Gaza Strip have evacuated south, and this is ahead of an expected ground assault by the Israeli military, which follows days of Israeli airstrikes in retaliation for attacks on Israel by Hamas. So to start us off, can you tell us what's happened so far and what's expected to come next?
So the weekend before last, Hamas breached Israeli defences, came into Israel and butchered hundreds of people, and also took a lot of hostages who remain in Gaza. So this has obviously triggered a huge response from Israel. The bombings have been intense over the last week and a bit. You know, there's been thousands going for days and days and days. Israeli forces have been massing in the north of Gaza. The bombings have flattened already buildings throughout Gaza. There's 2.3 million people in a very small place. It's about 140 square miles. And about half of those residents from the north, so it's about 1 million people, have been told to go south as the forces gather on the northern border. Aid groups are now saying, look, we just don't see how 1 million people can move to the south of the country in the time that they've been given to do so. The UN has warned that Gaza is facing an unprecedented human catastrophe, in its words, as it tries to evacuate elderly and children all to the south. We found out today that a designated safe road down towards the south that was bombed, 70 people died. There are terrible shortages of food, of fuel. Israel had already controlled the supply of fuel and food and water to Gaza and has been controlling that for about 16 years. So after the attacks last week, it tightened those controls. So the distress in Gaza at the moment is significant. These are people who are running for their lives. We don't know when this Israeli ground assault is going to start, but we do know that it's going to be in the north, which is obviously why they've asked civilians to leave, and it will be intense.
And you mentioned there, of course, that there's about 1.1 million residents in northern Gaza alone who have been told by the Israeli government, they were issued a warning, they have to evacuate the area. And the UN said, well, that's impossible. Can you help us understand the situation further? Why is it so impossible? And what does it mean for the people who are then stuck there?
We are seeing now, given these bombings, that the hospitals are becoming overloaded in Gaza. We have situations in which ice cream trucks are being used as morgues because there's so many bodies. There's photos now coming in from Gaza of babies with shrapnel wounds, and fuel is running out. Medical supplies were already scarce in Gaza, like this was already a problem. One of the reasons why the tunnel system was built was not just for weapons and for hiding and for terrorist activity. It was to try and smuggle things from Egypt, which included medical supplies. So you have a situation in which the hospitals are already on the smell of an oily rag. Gaza had a couple of hours electricity a day even before any of this happened. They're running out of fuel. They've been burning through fuel. So they're getting freshly wounded people coming in, and then to evacuate these people. You can imagine how difficult it would be even in Australia, like in bushfires and that sort of thing, how difficult it is. It's an extremely difficult operation, and the humanitarian groups are just saying, well, we can't do it.
And Jordan, last week you spoke to an Australian family stuck in Gaza, and I understand you can't name the person that you spoke to protect that person's safety in Gaza, and also because he works in a sensitive industry. But can you tell us, what did he tell you? Because he painted a very vivid picture of just how terrifying it is to be in Gaza right now and how he narrowly missed being hit by a bomb.
He's from Gaza. He left Gaza about 15 years ago. He's an extraordinarily intelligent guy, and he was offered by international universities scholarships. He actually had problems getting out of Gaza originally to take these scholarships and had to beg for help. He's since settled in Australia. He's one of these people that Australia's really lucky to have in terms of his qualifications and his intellect, and that of his wife also. They decided for the first time in 12 years to go back to Gaza to take their kids. They thought it was safe. The thing about Gaza is that while it has been under blockade for 16 years, the Palestinians I speak to who've been there recently said, look, people had kind of settled into this world of not all that much food, of having to be incredibly clever about recycling things. Gaza has been run since 2006 by Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation which hasn't had elections since 2006, which has stifled media and free speech. So this is not a pleasant government to live under. So, restrictions from Israel on one side and kind of pressure from its own government on another. It's been a difficult ride, but it is also beautiful. The beach is lovely. So they had this really nice 2 weeks, and then all hell broke loose, and their kids are just beside themselves. I mean, these are a couple of kids from Adelaide, this is all completely new to them. They're worried about feeding them. They're worried about their safety. A building that had been next door to their building was bombed. They now have had to flee southward. The problem with Gaza is they can't flee to the north through the Israeli border. That's where everyone's been told to leave from. Egypt has kept its border very, very tightly closed as well. It doesn't want 1 million Palestinian refugees on its border either, and it's had its own issues with Hamas. So this family has been begging the Australian government to do something. It is seeing flights going to and from Israel, taking Australian Israelis home, and they are literally trapped now in this horror show. Last I heard from this guy, he is down near the Egyptian border, hoping that all the international governments will work out some way to get Egypt to give safe passage to international residents. He keeps getting conflicting views. At some point he'll say, okay, yeah, all right, look, we're good, Egypt will be okay with it, and then actually no, sorry, hold tight. So they're absolutely terrified, beside themselves.
We'll be right back. And I wanted to turn to the ground war in Gaza. We know the Israeli Air Force said last week that they had already dropped 6,000 bombs on Gaza, and that we've heard some 2,600 Palestinian people have been killed. And Gaza is so densely populated, like you say, it's home to more than 2 million people in a space about half the size of Canberra. And you've written about the hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, nicknamed the Gaza Metro, that run through Gaza. So how will this densely populated terrain, which is just absolutely got this labyrinth of tunnels, what sort of impact will all of this have on a ground war? What could it possibly look like?
Well, so military experts are saying that Israel has an extraordinary army, like one of the best armies in the world, and it really concentrates on its defences. It's a huge priority for the country. Everyone basically does their national service at some point. It's got a massive wealth of strengths to draw on. But Gaza is a really, really, really difficult place to invade. As you say, there's the surface Gaza, which people call the civilian Gaza, and then there's this extremely intricate, sophisticated network of tunnels underneath Gaza, which people call the Hamas Gaza, the Hamas Metro. Plus, Gaza is extremely densely populated, lots of little alleyways, lots of Hamas snipers. Hamas is supported by Iran. It will have been planning for this. It knows the territory. So Israel will come in with its tanks. And look, I mean, obviously Israel's got lots of sophisticated equipment. There are theories that the reason the ground invasion hasn't happened yet is because it is still trying to suss out where these 150 hostages are and send in its sort of specialist units to try and get these guys out. And at the moment, about 1 million people live in northern Gaza. About 600,000 have evacuated. Hamas is saying don't evacuate. There's talk that Israel has been doing about basically turning it into rubble. Does it mean that they will now say, well, the north of Gaza is basically a war zone?
I wanted to turn now just for a moment, Jordan. You mentioned the hostages that Hamas has taken into Gaza. We know that Israel recently placed the number of Israeli hostages taken by Hamas to be 155 from Hamas's initial assault, which overran more than 20 pastoral communities in the south of Israel. So for those hostages in Gaza, what do you think a ground offensive might mean for them?
Oh, look, it's really, really difficult to tell. We don't even know if Israel knows where any of them are. And seeing the coverage of the families who are sticking up photographs of their children, their wives, their grandmothers, just absolutely distraught. The ground invasion's probably not good news for them. It would be difficult to see how this would work out for the hostages and their families.
And you mentioned there before that, Israel has said that its goal is to wipe out Hamas. Is that the only goal here? And what is the likelihood that the Israeli Defense Force could even achieve this? I have heard commentators say that it's impossible to wipe out a terrorist group with violence because you can't kill an idea, and that others will simply pick up where they've left off.
And I think this is the problem. Like, you may wipe out Hamas as it is now. Hamas is not particularly popular with Gazans. What Hamas did a week and a half ago has brought down this huge reaction from the international community and from Israel. They're feeling like they've been tarnished with this brush. But by the same token, when you've got people who are completely desperate, who've lost their families, who've lost their homes, who feel like they've been treated like animals, to quote a senior Israeli official, this anger can fester into much, much, much greater violence. This is the sort of thing that does create pockets of extremism, because when you have deeply disaffected people who feel strongly that the world has betrayed them, is a really good breeding ground for extreme violence and terrorism. And we've seen that time and again over many, many years in Afghanistan, in Iraq. We've seen the rise of ISIS. We've seen things happen like this in Syria. So it's also a dangerous time for disaffection. They may squash Hamas, but what will come next?
Well, I have a feeling, Jordan, that this unfortunately won't be the last time we speak about this, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sam.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Tammy Mills and Julia Carr-Katzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.